warning that the meeting will be filmed, and if anybody doesn't want to be filmed, if they could notify the clerk so they don't appear. Thanks very much indeed. If we go to the agenda, firstly, have we got any apologies for absence?
I've not received any, Chair.
Thank you. Urgent business, I've not been notified of any. Declarations of interest? Chair. Yes, Councillor Davis.
I won't be able to take part in item number 7 because of a personal interest.
Thank you. Any other item? Any other? No. Public questions, I've not been notified of any.
None received, Chair.
Minutes of the previous meeting, I'll move them as a correct record.
Agreed.
Has anybody got any comments on them? No? Thank you. If we then can go up to item number 6, which is the first application, which is Poolfold Failsworth, and this is an application because it's a relation of a council member, and I'll ask the planning officer to introduce the item.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, as you've set out there, this is an application for 6 Poolfold in Failsworth. And as you can see, hopefully, on the screen behind me, the proposal is for the removal of an existing conservatory on a dwelling house and the erection of a single-storey rear extension and also a new bay window to the front elevation. So, members don't normally are not normally referred these applications for determination, householder applications. So the reason being, as briefly been set out, the applicant is the son of Councillor Elaine Gary. So as such, in accordance with the council scheme of all the protocols essentially, and in the interest of transparency, it's been referred to you for determination. So briefly, the proposal relates to a property within the turning head of the cul-de-sac, which is Poolfold. And we've got an existing plan here to show the existing configuration of the site. So essentially it's replacing an existing rear extension with another rear extension to the conservatory with a more traditional brick arrangement. So I can show you the comparison on screen here, show the existing front and rear elevations. We've got the existing side elevations that show the existing conservatory to the rear. And then if I move on to the proposed plans, you can see the position of the proposed rear extension and also the bay window to the front, and that's reflected in the elevations that you can see on the screen. And there for comparison is the floor plans. So essentially this has been considered against our general amenity policy and design policy, which is how such applications are normally considered. And in blunt, the proposals comply with those policies, and as such, the application is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions that are set out on the report. So that's the introduction, Chair.
Has anybody got any questions on the planning office presentation? No? Okay, if we can then go straight into either decision or debate. Has anybody got any comments? Okay, could I formally move approval with the conditions? And second by Councillor Brownrigg. All those in favour? Thank you, that's unanimous. Okay, if we then can move on to item 7, which is Mosson Lane East, and this is an application to change from a residential dwelling to a residential institution. This was refused by committee and then and also refused on appeal. There's been changes to the application which will be outlined by the planning officer.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So yes, just to Just to repeat some of that then, so this application is the change of use of the property. It's 298 Mostyn Lane East. It falls in the Chadderton South ward, and it's a proposed change of use from its existing use as a dwelling, although it is vacant at the moment, and the changes to a residential institution, and along with extensions that are proposed, single story and first floor levels to particularly the rear, but also the side. So the application, just for a bit of context, here is located on the northern side of Mostyn Lane East. It sits between Broadway and Hollywood Avenue to the north. And then we've got some photographs that show the context of the property. So this is the view from Mostyn Lane East that shows the front of the property. And then we've also got another property here to the rear. And you can see there are some ongoing works that I think have stalled at the moment pending the outcome of this application. But that's the context of the existing situation on the site. So the change of use of the property is the fundamental part of the application. So the residential institution use is essentially 24-hour support provided to people diagnosed with mental health needs or learning disabilities, and aimed at those that are 18 years and above. And the scale of the use is for 8 full-time residents who would occupy the property. So to accommodate the proposed use, there are extensions proposed to the property. So we've got plans that show the current configuration of the site, which obviously includes quite a significant single-storey rear extension along the boundary. And then equally, we've got a first floor plan that shows the roof plan of that single-storey projection to the rear. And these are the elevation drawings, again, showing what the current configuration is. So in terms of the extent of the extensions, there is relevant planning history to this site. So basically a similar planning application has previously been refused, and that was at the end of last year in November, and that was on the grounds that the use would cause noise and disturbance to surrounding neighbours, and that the proposed single-storey extension adjacent to the boundary with number 300, which is the elevation to the top of that plan. Unfortunately, I can't see my cursor on the screen, but it's the one at the top of the plan underneath the word ground that's with the annotation. So that was considered to result in significant loss of light to the occupiers of that property, and cause harm to the amenity of those occupiers. So there was in effect 2 reasons for the previous refusal. So then looking at the sequence of events, what followed that decision was the application was then, the decision was subject of an appeal made to the planning inspectorate, and although the appeal was actually dismissed, it was only on the grounds of the impact of the extension proposed next to the boundary of number 300 Mostyn Lane East. And the inspector agreed basically that that proposed element of the extension would cause harm to the occupiers of number 300 by making habitable rooms served by windows to the rear elevation very dark. So the resubmission application, which is the one that's presented to you today, has been referred to committee by Councillor Shuttleworth, who has raised objections to the application. And essentially the key difference is the reduction in the size of the extension adjacent to number 300 from just over 6 metres in projection to 4 metres. And that's in order to address the principal concern that was raised by the inspector when dismissing the appeal. And basically this is considered to be a material change which significantly reduces the impact on the occupiers of number 300. So in terms of the actual principle of the use, it is extremely important to have regard to the inspector's decision with respect to the previous application. and that has to be afforded significant weight in the determination of this application. So the inspector considered that the proposed use would not adversely affect the living conditions of nearby residents, and that was either through increased traffic noise or through noise generated through the use of the actual property itself, but also the use of the outdoor amenity space, so the garden area as well. And that, I must re-emphasise that must be taken into account in your assessment of this application today, and given significant weight. So this is in the face of the current application having received a large number of objections from residents who are objecting to the use and the impacts that would be associated or likely to be associated with it. And I think it's also important to set out the environmental health colleagues have maintained their objections to the application on the grounds of noise impact and the adverse impact that they consider could arise for neighbours given the comings and goings to the property by both staff and visitors. So essentially, officers consider that the principle of the proposed use is now acceptable, having regard to the significant weight that must be afforded to the inspector's decision. However, it is important that we have regard to the consideration of the conditions attached to the recommendation, which include measures to minimise the impact of noise by restricting shift patterns of staff, so to avoid changeover of staff between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. on any day. In terms of the impact of the proposed rear extension on number 300, the reduction in the projection is essentially considered to address the principal reasons for the inspector's decision, and on that basis, the application is now recommended for approval, subject to the imposition of the conditions set out in the report. Thank you.
Has anybody got any questions of the planning officer initially? Councillor Brownridge.
Just an initial question. The very long, thin extension at the back, has that had planning permission already?
It is certainly an established extension. There is the relevant history set out in the report, which it does include an extension there's two applications. Obviously, the previous one I've alluded to already, and also another application in 2020 that was actually refused for extensions to the property. That question I haven't necessarily got the answer to, but what I can say is, it's my understanding, it is an established extension. It certainly doesn't look to be a modern extension. But
Okay, well, I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer. I'd really like, some more substance to that. My overwhelming question is, I don't understand how this business is going to operate. There's no information at all about how this business will actually run. So the decisions made on noise and disturbance activity have no substance to them. I mean, the inspector said something like, it is believed that, and I don't think that's good enough. We ought to have some evidence about how this actually works. Now, they talk about I think the notice on the front talks about being in discussions with the National Health, actually responding to a need. So I would have expected the applicant to actually produce some evidence about the discussions, because I know one of the objections talked about the accommodation not being appropriate. The planning response was that's not normally a planning issue, which I would accept, but the whole application is predicated on a very specific use about which we have no information. So if that accommodation isn't appropriate, then the very use we're granting will be asked to grant planning permission for can't be implemented. And then you're left with a building that's got permission to extend and then there's got to find an alternative use for. So I would like to know more about individual care plans. What does that mean in terms of support staff? Do they have individual care workers? Do they have therapists? Do they have counsellors? And it's all right to say they'll all be coming in the daytime, but if you've got 8 residents with 8 separate care workers, you have got potentially a traffic issue here. And I appreciate there's on-street car parking, and I appreciate we're not going to be talking about accommodating all that car parking on site, and you'd have to make a balance. I don't think we have enough information to make that balanced judgment at the moment. I'm quite concerned about the staff turnover, that if those parking spaces are taken, the new staff come, they have to park somewhere else, then they come on site, then the existing staff go, do they then leave the site to move their cars? I mean, it all just seems a bit amorphous to me, and I would like to know a lot more about how it actually works. Similarly, it's been assumed that the staff will come by public transport. I suspect a lot of the staff are going to be female. A lot of women will be very nervous about going home on the bus at 10 o'clock at night when their shift finishes. So I think that's an assumption. Again, there ought to be evidence from existing operations to give substance to those statements. So I think it's just, to me, is a number of unanswered questions, and I'm a bit surprised that the inspector glibly came to that decision, unless she had a lot more evidence as part of the appeal, which hasn't been reflected in this committee report, which I assume she didn't. I think she was a bit glib about that, because we don't have enough information about how it works in practice. So no quarrel with the principle of it, that's perfect. I understand entirely it complies with policy. I just think I need a lot more flesh on the bone to actually work out whether it is going to have an impact on residential amenity. Thank you.
Would you like to reply?
Yeah, I think obviously we're looking at the principle of a use, and obviously any use can result in different impacts. I know the inspector in their report looked at in their decision they had regard to the increased intensity of the use and gave regard to the size of the accommodation, including the extensions proposed, and came to the conclusion that that would not have a detrimental impact on nearby residents. Now, whether we like that outcome or not, we have to accept it and give significant weight to that appeal decision as I set out. A lot of the impacts that you've described, these potential impacts, depends on how the property is run and managed, and that, can stray outside of the planning remit as well. In planning terms, we're looking at the actual nature of the use, not the management of the way that the business is essentially run. So whilst obviously we understand there may well be impacts, we do have to respect the inspector's decision. There's been no material changes on site since that decision was made by the inspector, and equally we've not had any material changes to any policies. So it wouldn't be reasonable to come to a different conclusion on the matter of the principle of the actual proposed use.
Well, if I could come back, Chair, if you don't mind, I have a problem with that, because I don't see, the whole point is this being put forward for a very specific use. All right, within a broad use class, yes, but it's been sold on the basis this is for a particular clientele for which there is demand and for which the applicant is allegedly in conversations with providers. So I think it's quite reasonable for us to say, right, we want more information about how this actually operates. So I think to try and distinguish, because the whole point is it's being recommended for approval on the basis of that use. But if we don't know what that use implicates, we don't actually know whether that's reasonable. So it's all right, the inspector coming to the conclusion that there wouldn't be any additional noise and activity. But how do we know that when we don't know what the noise and activity is if you're talking about 8 individual, as I say, if they all have individual care packages? I just want to know what that actually means. So whilst I entirely accept the inspector's decision's material consideration, I still think we're entitled to say we want more information before we accept that, to me, what have been very, very broad statements by the applicant's agent and the inspector, very, very broad statements without any digging to see what that actually means. And I would have expected an application like this to be accompanied with evidence of how these uses operate elsewhere, because that's normally what you would do as an applicant. You put a lot of evidence in to reassure people that this isn't theoretical, there's practical basis for the statements that are being made, and I don't see them here. So at the very least, I have some real concerns that we just don't know enough to actually come to I don't know enough to come to a conclusion. Obviously, I leave to my colleagues to come to their own conclusions. Thank you, Chair.
We do have a number of people that have indicated. Could I just remind you, this is just questions to the planning officer at this stage. Councillor Torr.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Councillor Brownage, she already covered a lot of the concerns that she raised, and I shared those concerns. Traffic noise, I think that's one of the issue that I am also concerned. Parking, and it's not really fair on the local residents to put up with something which there's a lot of issues, a lot of concerns. So I think I'll share those concerns.
Possibly you can pick up Councillor Woodburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please can the planning officer clarify what exactly is meant by institution in this instance, because I note the report states it's for people aged 18 years and over with mental health and learning disabilities. And also, can the planning officer set out in very clear terms for us what exactly has changed to alter the recommendation this time from the last application? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So the proposed use as a residential institution is covered through use class C2 within the use classes order. So it essentially includes residential uses with an element of care. So it includes other uses such as care homes, for example. So that's the nature of the actual use. In terms of the key change between what previously has been refused by the council and then subject to the subsequent appeal is the reduction in the size of the extension adjacent to the boundary with number 300 Moston Lane East. So that's been reduced from approximately 6 metres, reduced in projection to 4. So it's basically been reduced by a third. And the view of officers is that change is considered to address the loss of light to the habitable room windows to that neighbouring property. That was the issue. That's the key issue.
Councillor Gloucester.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if it's a typo, but it actually refers to 9 residents in the report rather than 8, which is correct.
May I ask which page you're looking at? Sorry, Councillor.
I read that there was originally applications for 9 residents, but this application's for 8.
Well, we do have a condition set out in the recommendation at condition 5, which is no more than 8 residents shall live at the application property at any one time.
So is that a typo then? Is that what we're...
Yeah, as set out...
on page 10.
Yeah, the recommendation is for inclusion of that condition limiting the number of residents to 8. So yes.
Okay, that's not my only question. Does the 30% rule still exist?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that question.
Does the 30% rule still exist?
30% for the 30% for the extension, do you mean?
In terms of the assessment of any extension to a building, we're looking at our policy. We have in our local plan we have policy 9, which is a general amenity policy that allows us to assess impact on adjoining properties, having regards to the site circumstances, and also we have policy 20 that covers design. I'm not aware of any prescribed rule around a third. That's not to my knowledge, no.
Councillor Brownie, do you want?
Will this then be licensed after planning? Will this have to go to licensing, or once planning's through, is that it?
Obviously, the remit of the planning committee is to assess the planning application. Presumably, there will be a need to have the business registered, but that's a separate issue altogether to the planning remit. So I couldn't say with absolute confidence that it would need to be referred to licensing, but I can only assume it would, unless my
The honest answer, Councillor, is that we don't know because it's not a planning matter whether it would go to a licensing or not. if that is required under the council policies or the national legislation, then it will do. If it's not, then it won't do, but it's not part of the planning merit of the case.
Did you want to come back, Councillor Brownridge?
Yes, sorry, I just had a question about waste. It says in the report that there's room to put the bins somewhere where they can't be seen and they're not in front of windows. Do we know where they're going? Because I interpreted the plans to say there was no access from the back to the front because of the side extension they're putting in. So if the bins are going in the back, how are they going to get onto the front to be emptied? Do we know?
If there is concern about the positioning of refuse, where then there could of course be an additional condition if it was to be approved this evening, which could be included, requiring further details. I mean, there is a recess at the front of the property where, you know, at least some of the refuse bins could be stored out of sight. There is a wall around the front of the property which would help mitigate any impact. And obviously what we'd have to consider is whether there's a significant material difference between the amount of waste generated from the use of a large domestic use as a dwelling. Obviously the size of the building as it stands now would be capable of accommodating a large family, and the difference that would be with the proposed use. So it's whether that would be considered to be reasonable in planning terms.
Well, in fairness, if it was a large family, they wouldn't be entitled to any more bins than a small family. So, you know, that's a bit of a red herring. But I do think we need to know because, you know, as a general rule of thumb, we try not to have bins in the front gardens if we can possibly help it because it's not particularly sightly. One suspects that there will be slightly more refuse because you've got 8 people plus staff on site all the time. So I think rather than the condition, again, to me, that's information we should have at this stage because it's all very well putting condition on, but if the only way they can satisfy that is to put the bins in the front garden, that would not be something we would be happy about, and we'd like to know that again before we grant planning permission. I mean, it's a bit of a bugbear with me that we don't ask enough about waste disposal strategies as part of any submission, and it is quite crucial because where the bins go and how they got out to be collection can have a very significant impact on the street scene and on amenities. So again, I would think this is something we ought to have before we make a final decision. Thank you.
Councillor Surgeon.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a quick question. I know the proposal says there'll be up to 8 people potentially living in this property with an additional perhaps 8 members of staff. So in terms of, for example, toilet facilities, wash facilities, what exactly is the plan? Because I've looked through the application and I don't see any details in there. And again, for the people that were potentially living in there, will all their rooms have, for example, sufficient window, lights, etc. coming through? I don't see that detail in this report.
Okay, any requirements such as that would there would be an overlap between the requirements for the if the use needs to be registered, there'll be the requirements of any building regulations, the requirements of any licensing requirements, and those sit parallel but are completely separate to the planning process. So I don't consider we could give significant amount of weight to those factors, but I can only assume that the design of the property and the layout and the facilities provided meet the needs of any requirements that the applicant is required to make in that regard.
Okay, I'm mindful that we've got speakers, and at this stage I'd like to call Mr. Judge to speak. Mr. Judge will be able to speak for 3 minutes. You'll be told when you've got 30 seconds left, Mr. Judge. So if you're ready, if you could address the meeting, and obviously you're speaking against the application. Are you ready, Mr. Judge, to speak? Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Do I just start or? Yeah. I've lived on Moston Lane East for 30 years with a family-orientated, close-knit community. 298 is a much sought-after residential property. Overdevelopment of this site is a big concern. Having already had major building work done without planning permission, the size and nature of the proposed institution totally changes the landscape for all neighbouring properties, including 298. The planning officer's report clearly stated that environmental health considered the property is not a suitable location for C2 use and recommend the application be refused due to the impact on residential amenity. This has not been addressed. The Winterbourne View report, page 38, Appendix 2, states, institutions should be closed and replaced with ways of supporting people with learning disabilities which allow us to live in ordinary homes, in our own community, with the people we choose. There are a number of risks to the occupants in terms of suicidal ideation. Canal, unmanned railway and tram lines and motorway bridges are within 10 minutes walk from 298. Given the complex needs of 8 residents, noise pollution for neighbours is likely to be excessive 24/7. Proposed staffing levels of 2 per 8 residents raise security concerns as being inadequate, as the first application proposed 6 staff to 9 residents. The double extension will be approximately 500 millimetres from the neighbour's fence. The reduction from 6 to 4 metres will have little impact on reducing the tunnelling effect and will clearly cause an overbearing impact, drastically reducing the outlook and causing significant loss of light for number 300. Access for maintenance and repair to shared drainage will be severely compromised. Parking. As one side of Moston Lane East is on-street parking only, there is tremendous competition for spaces for residents and customers of numerous nearby businesses. The proposed 3 parking spaces are totally inadequate given the expected traffic to 298, family health visitors, CQC, etc. Noise and disruption will inevitably follow, as is the case at a nearby HMO on Northfield Road. There is evidence of regular complaints from neighbours about noise and frequent police visits. Families with young children in close proximity are concerned about their children's safety regarding an institution of this nature. A playgroup and out-of-school club for under 7s are 100 metres away and walk past 298 daily, also a nearby infants and junior school. Residents have experienced intimidatory and threatening behaviour from the applicant's builders. The applicant appears to have no knowledge in setting up and running an establishment of this nature, his background being in domiciliary care homes. People who are destined to reside in what are effectively brick huts in a back garden deserve so much better. A custom-made unit with lots of amenities, space and off-street parking, a large day room for family and visitors to sit, adequate numbers of on-site staff. This applicant is motivated by money alone, not care. Please reject this unwarranted application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Judge. Has anybody got any questions of Mr. Judge? Yes, Councillor Lancaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I hear correctly at the beginning of the speech that there was some development prior to approval being awarded, or did I mishear or misunderstand that point? Just if you could elaborate, please.
Can you just repeat? Was it about the...
I thought I heard at the beginning of your remarks that you said there was some aspect of development prior to an approval being given for it.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
You've seen the photographs, and it shows a large extent. That's a massive garden, by the way. It shows a large extent of that garden being already built, brick built. We have photographs, we've got CCTV of very, very large containers from last year being constantly filled with earth, excavated earth. They had one of them in the diggers, and it was carrying earth through constantly for at least 2 weeks. There must have been hundreds of tons of soil taken out. They'd already built the footings, no planning permission. They built all these, they've erected all these buildings, the walls, you've seen them on not that photograph, but on other photographs, but on that one, on the left-hand side, and next to the fence down at the bottom, that was all done without any planning permission whatsoever.
Thank you. Councillor Gloucester.
What size is what's already been erected?
Size
What size has already been built?
What size of the building?
Yeah, is it the full 6 metres that's already been constructed?
Sorry. As you're looking at that picture there, the extension from halfway in the garden, which goes, it runs the full length of a very large garden run. Now, I know Councillor Shuttleworth was taking some photographs, and it shows the very end is possibly 4 foot away from a neighbour's fence line, which is actually not on Moston Lane East, it's on Hollywood Avenue. All of that has been built, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the downstairs extension, the ground floor extension, there was something from the house already, I think, but certainly the last part, where you can see it squared off there, in other words, the 6 metres, that has been built without planning permission. And the tunnelling effect will be even worse once the first floor extension is built on top of that.
Okay, thanks very much,
Thank you.
Mr. Judge. If I could ask Councillor Shuttleworth to contribute now, please.
Thanks, Chair. Good evening, members. I do need to actually go back a little bit in terms of this to give you the true picture of just what's happened. When development started on this site, I was contacted by a resident who obviously was concerned about the action that was underway. And enforcement went down onto the site, building control went down onto the site, and both advised the developer cum owner that if they carried on without sending in an application, then they would do so at their own risk. Despite that, they carried on. And what we've got now is a shell. And we're talking about taking 2 metres off a 6 metre building. Well, the shell's already there. It's there. It's built. All we've got to do is fill it in. Now, I want to go to the papers that were sent in by A to Z Estates to justify last year's application. The property consists of 3 bedrooms, and it's important you remember that. It's 3 bedrooms. And they go on to say, there is an attached single-storey self-contained flat known as 298 Moston Lane East. There was no application ever submitted for 298A Moston Lane East. It was a garage that was converted without permission. It says the property was previously under the ownership of the Methodist Church for several years, who had other outbuildings at the rear where the nuns used to reside, as well as holding Sunday school there. To the best of my knowledge, having been behind that property on Sunday, there was no outbuildings, or there are no outbuildings, no evidence of outbuildings, and if you talk to neighbours, what they will tell you is that the nuns didn't live there. It was actually the minister from the Chamber Methodist, which was about a mile away, and there was no Sunday schools held there. I'm actually skipping through a number of papers, so, you know, if there's a pause, I've not gone away, I'm just looking for the next comment. They also say the provision of this facility will be a significant benefit to the borough and help to ease the pressure on local health services. So we're talking of the borough being Oldham and local health services being Oldham. And again, I ask you to bear that in mind. He said the proposal development is not dominant in terms of its scale and massing. Well, I'll make reference to the planning inspector's report there. They also say the property is currently vacant, has proved difficult to let, and has remained empty for large periods of time, leading to vandalism. The tenants attracted have been unsuitable for the property and area. Here is a copy of the electoral register for 2019. It shows that number 298 is occupied by Joanne Hall. I asked a colleague to check up what was shown for this year's local election, and 298 is registered to a Joanne Hall. And I think as far back as 2015, we can show that somebody was, I will use the word allegedly, resident. So why is the applicant saying it was actually unoccupied, when forms go to the properties, and if there's any change, you're expected to return them, indicating the change. It goes on to say, provide care facilities to local residents who currently need them and would otherwise struggle to live independently. The development is not overlooking neighbouring properties and will not disturb the neighbours. Well, anything that runs down the back of more or less fills a garden, and as you just heard one resident, the residents to my left say, it's about 4 metres of somebody's boundary fence. That's disturbing people. You know, we've actually got potential occupants who will be sleeping in the garden. I want to turn to the application report on 27th of March, and I think Martin made reference to this. The environmental health said, I do not believe that the property is in a suitable location for C2 use. I therefore recommend refusal of the application due to the potential loss of amenity of local residents. At least the environmental health have been consistent in their opposition to this particular building and development, and they maintain their opposition now. In the recommendation for refusal, and this is the officer's report, the concentration of people on site and the coming and going of visitors to and from the site are likely to cause significant increased levels of activity and unacceptable noise disturbance to occupiers of neighbouring properties contrary to Policy 9 of the Oldham Local Plan. The proposed single-storey development, again, a reason. You heard John mention a tunnelling effect. That was another reason. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed in this application is the view of the planning officer. It's still the same building that was there 18 months ago. It hasn't altered. Nothing has been removed. For some reason, in February this year, there was another application for the same site for a different use. It would appear to be for domestic purpose. So what is it? Is it an institution? Do they want it to be a home? What is it they actually want it to be? And the statement here for refusal, based on this one, the proposed development would not improve the economic, social and environmental conditions of the area and therefore does not comprise sustainable development. I want to hopefully have time to tell you what the planning inspector has said. Now, I know the officer has quoted in the report as to reasons why it should go through. Now, let me tell you what isn't in the planning report that was in the planning inspector's report. Number 300 has patio doors that are close to the common boundary. These serve a habitable room and are the only windows serving the room. The extension will project over 6 metres from the rear elevation of the house, and although called a conservatory, will have a solid brick side elevation. Although the extension will have a flat roof, it will still be clearly visible above the boundary fence. Consequently, I consider that the proposed development would unacceptably harm the living conditions of the occupiers at number 300 Mostyn Lane East, with particular regard to outlook and light. The appellant has stated that currently comprises of 3 bedrooms plus the 1-bedroom flat, although the council states that planning permission has not been granted for any subdivision of the property. And an important bit here, I consider an increase from 4 bedrooms, which is the 3 bedrooms in the house plus the converted garage, to 9 represents a significant intensification in the use of the house. As I say, members, nothing has changed. It's still there. There's speculation in terms of who can use a property. You know, they're saying, well, 8 people in there will be like a large family. Well, this isn't a large family. This is 8 individuals, all with their own behavioural manners, idiosyncrasies. So how are they going to get on? Well, you know, it's not like a family where if there's a dispute, mum or dad can bring someone to bear, or big brother or big sister can actually grab hold of them and take them indoors and wag the finger at them. It's 8 individuals who may or may not get on. who may or may not be able to live together. And those are the people that will be between the properties and living on Mostyn Lane East. And that needs to be taken into account. And again, in the report, he's also told the planning inspector the property is currently vacant, and the appellant has stated that it's difficult to let. It's often vacant for lengthy periods and prone to vandalism. Now, if we look at the application report that the officer's got, on page 1, the site, it has previously been significantly extended with a large single-storey rear extension. Just a pity that he didn't include that none of these extensions have ever had planning permission. None of them. In fact, I went on the system, and I apologise, there's one where there's a planning application made in 1986 and alteration to form a conservatory. That is the only application, apart from these three made reference to, that you will find anywhere in terms of this particular building. Again, Environmental Health have made a report in there about it. And all time's going on, so I'll just update you now. As members know, I sent you an image of the poster that's outside the house, which says, working with NHS and local authority, care providers and charities. Now, last year, when I saw this, I actually sent, this year, I sent a letter to, don't get my dates wrong, last year, this is May 2020, I should say. And this is from the Managing Director, Health and Adult Social Care Community Services, Mark Warren, making reference to the sign outside. The sign suggests that the local authority and the clinical commissioning group are knowing of and in support of the development, and MN, which is Mohammed Naeem, apologised that this was misleading. Now, if he knew it was misleading last year, why is it still there? And it goes on to say, to confirm he had not gained any support from the Health and Social Care Commission teams in Oldham. He advised he has used the logos as his commission services from neighbouring localities in Stockport, Bolton and Liverpool. Now, I made reference before to the borough. As far as I know, the borough doesn't extend to Stockport, Bolton and Liverpool. So who is this for? He goes on to say, we would expect any new organisation wishing to provide care and support for Oldham residents to approach and discuss with us what our needs are for developing such a service. To finish, if the development should be granted, there is absolutely no guarantee that Oldham's Health and Social Care Commissioners would use it without ensuring that it would meet our standard quality requirements. And asked him for an update if his views were still the same, if anything had changed. And this is timed at 16:42 today. ASC, Adult Social Care Commissioners, have not had any further involvement with the provider/developer of this service since the last update was provided. The provider/developer has also not been in contact with housing strategy or planning to discuss the potential need for such a development in Oldham or any gaps in the market that may exist. And he goes on to say, any providers wishing to provide services commissioned by the council will need to demonstrate their ability to meet contractual and service quality standards. There are no guarantees that should the planning application be approved, the provision will be used to support people with care and support needs in Oldham. Indeed, without going through the above process, which is a number of points he raised earlier, it is unlikely that any services will be commissioned, and the provider is likely, therefore, to offer places to non-Oldham residents. In addition, should the planning application be approved and the provision used by other local authorities for their residents with complex needs, there will be implications for local primary care, community health, learning disability and mental health services in order to provide access to local health and social work support for people living in the borough. And if I may conclude, Chair, we talk about noise and disturbance and how 8 residents won't make any difference. So what about laundry? There's going to be 8 people living there plus staff. Where's the washing going to be done? Is that going to be collected? Who's going to deal with the laundry for the 8 residents of the place? They're not going to do their own washing. What's going to be the situation in terms of visiting of family, friends? You know, is there going to be 8 people who could be in the garden? Or is it going to be 16? Or is it going to be 20? Nobody knows. Because you do not have any idea just how often people will be on the premises. You don't know what's going to happen in terms of clinicians. You know, we're talking about people with mental health issues come autism, whichever they might use. Who's going to be there? Where are they going to park? How's the food going to be delivered? Is it going to be cooked on the premises? Is it pre-cooked? How often are they going to come? There are lots and lots of questions. Moston Lane East, as identified, is a busy road. Putting more cars in it is just going to make matters worse. And the people who are going to suffer are the residents. And what I would ask you to bear in mind, if this was in your ward, if this was the back of your house, what would your views be? Now, this extension, as you can see from that plan up there, if you look at the 3 blocks at the bottom, that's run right down the garden. That's the equivalent of 3 garages, minimum. There's a shell right round. Where's the waste bin going to go? That's enclosed. Is the waste bin going to go more or less at the bottom there, in the middle, where you see a space? Is the waste going to be opposite 296? Is it right that clinical waste or potential clinical waste
is it possible,
should be there?
Councillor Shuttleworth, that you could possibly, you know, come to a conclusion?
Yeah, all right, Chair. So as I say, you know, the reasons put forward for this development have been scotched, being found out. You know, you've heard what the managing directors had to say. There's no involvement with Oldham as it stands. Yeah, he is showing that. Thank you, Chair.
Has anybody got any questions of Councillor Shuttleworth? Okay, thank you. It is now open for debate, if anybody's got any observations or comments. Councillor Brownridge.
Sorry, you'd expect me to say yes, wouldn't you? I mean, I think taking what the planning officer said about the material consideration of the inspector's decision, I'd like to propose we defer this application and ask for additional information covering the points that I made and Councillor Shuttleworth sort of reinforced really. So in particular, the planning status of the extensions that are partially constructed. Secondly, the waste disposal strategy, where the bins are going and how many they're going to be and how that's going to work. But crucially and most importantly, whether this accommodation is suitable for the clientele it is supposedly going to satisfy, and how the business will actually operate so we can make a proper assessment of the consequences in terms of visitor numbers and activity on the site. So I take the account that the inspector's made a view on this, but I reiterate that I think we need more information to see whether we think her judgment is correct. So that would be my proposal, that we defer and ask for additional information on those particular points. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I was just reading there is a piece within the report on the waste storage and where it's actually going to be.
With respect, Chair, it doesn't say that.
Sorry?
It says there's room for it not to be in public display, but not exactly where it is and how it works.
Could, firstly, I ask the view of the officers regarding the actual running of the establishment, whether that is a particular planning concern, or I'm not saying it shouldn't be a planning concern, or whether it is something we should give due weight to.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So, obviously, you've been presented with a recommendation today, and that's obviously followed all the relevant history, which includes the previous application and the subsequent appeal decision. So, with this significant weight that needs to be attached to the appeal decision, that's obviously formed the basis of our recommendation today. We have refused it before in terms of the principle of the use because of the impact, and the inspector's not agreed with that position. We have to give significant weight to that. So, it is a recommendation. If the application is deferred, as is being suggested, we can open up the conversation further with the applicant to provide any additional information to give some more certainty about how the use would be managed. They could pretend, it's unfortunate there's not a representative from the applicant's side here today to provide that, but that is an option going forward. So ultimately it's up to the committee which route they want to take on this.
Yes, Councillor Alan Downey.
Thank you, Chair. It's just in terms of the questions that were just asked for more information on, and in terms of the weight that we can put on the environmental health recommendation versus the planning inspectorate decision. There is a clear change in terms of the number of staff on the premises. So originally it was 8 residents and 6 members of staff. It's now 8 and 2. And there's no information anywhere I can see on what impact that potentially would have on that amount of noise. Now, you might say that the operation is not a matter for planning, but in terms of this, that would presumably determine the amount of noise that is being made. So that has to be a planning consideration, because that's how the thing we are deciding on planning is determined. And without that information, I don't see how we could give planning approval to this. There just isn't the information there, it seems, to justify that. So in addition to what Councillor Brownridge has said, I think there's more information needed there, because we can't correctly judge the weight of those 2 opinions without it.
Thank you, Councillor Alan Downey. Councillor Sajan.
Thank you, Chair. I echo what my colleagues have said, and I can't in good conscience make a decision today based on the lack of information, and my concerns are about the overcrowdedness of that home. I know you're saying that they'll be in line with the other section in terms of toilet facilities and lighting, but again, just to echo, in terms of the volume of people that are in that property, we need more details. So I second the motion to have more details and to defer this application. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got it moved and seconded that this item's deferred. I think that what would be helpful is if anybody's got any other issues that want to be considered during the deferral time, if it's approved. I think there's been mention of how the establishment would be run, the number of staffing, the noise, where the clientele would come from, and the connection into either the health or social care system. So those are some of the issues that have been raised. Has anybody else got any issues? Sorry, Councillor Woodward.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. In all honesty, I'm at a loss tonight because the residents say the application hasn't changed since the last time, and the officers say it has changed since the last time. So, as committee members, who should we believe?
Well, could I just stop you there? Basically, the application that is being made has changed. Now, whether the situation on site has changed or not, we aren't considering. The application's changed in the respect that the inspector did say that the extension in the rear garden was over large, and that's why he refused it. The application before us today reduces that extension by 2 metres, hence the recommendation from the officers. So the 2 applications have changed in that material context.
Okay. Well, fine, that's okay. But personally, I think we should give the residents some certainty and vote on it tonight. So I won't be supporting a deferral.
I think that we have to be mindful that if we defer this and get more information and then give it due consideration, we can then actually build a case of whatever we're going forward, either approval or being able to substantiate any refusal in future, because basically if we decide to refuse the application, it has to have substantial support and substantial reasoning for refusing it, or else we could finish up in a situation where the council would be liable for significant costs. You know, so I think that if we do gather that body of information, if it's deferred, it may actually strengthen whatever case members decide at a future meeting. Yes, Councillor Lancaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering, if the item is deferred, would there be any mechanism or investigation to explore the many alleged untruths, if you will, in the application, or motivations which haven't been kept true by the applicant? Because I think we can only judge present reasons for an application if we can be assured that the applicant has been fair and reasonable and proper in previous dealings. So I don't know if there's any mechanisms to give more further investigation to that.
I think the best mechanism we would have available to us is to not demand, but very, very strongly ask a representative be at the next meeting. You know, that they can actually be questions and answer any concerns that members may have.
Chair, if I may, Chair, if I can make a comment on that point, if that's okay. I just think we need to be very clear in terms of that question, that when we are looking at planning decisions and planning matters, who the applicant is, their character, none of that is a planning consideration. And we have to be very clear on that. Otherwise, we are falling foul of the legislation and what have you. So I think what Councillor Dean has suggested, you know, if the applicant were willing to come and make their case in front of you, that's very helpful. We have that on the next item tonight, so it's always very helpful when they do that. But it cannot be about the character of the person.
Thanks, Chair. Just if we do go for referral, is there any way of the residents, the public, having more time? Because I know one of the notes on the paper here is additional time for the neighbours to lodge objections. Will there be more time for the residents and the neighbours to lodge objections to this if we do go for referral? Is it open to them as well?
I'm sure that if they've got any further objections, we always, albeit there's always the 21 days consultation, we always will hear any objections right up to the day of the planning application. So if anybody's got any further objections or any further reasons for objecting, they'll always be addressed and put in the reports. Councillor Lancaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in response to the point made around character, it wasn't about the character of the applicant per se. It was just I'm conscious that we don't. It doesn't seem appropriate to me to reward approval to an applicant who may not have been honest in previous developments or otherwise. And I'm just keen that we have some further information which can be sort of legitimately verified and given further evidence about that, so we can be just have that broader context and understanding before we consider the present application in front of us.
Anyway, what I was just going to suggest, rather than labour this part any more at this stage, I think it may be helpful if we actually put it to the vote. It's actually has been moved and seconded that this matter is deferred. Before that, I have had two further indications. We'll let them speak and then we'll put it to the vote after that. Councillor Alandani, and then...
Mine was just at the point at which you asked about areas for further information. Just because we're talking about people with, it talks about learning and disability, it's not completely clear on that. And there was a question before about sort of wash facilities, toilet facilities, etc. Just whether it is likely that the residents would need kind of complex support needs and therefore there should be provision made in the application for that. because I haven't seen anything around that. So or if they are excluded, because then the reverse of that is that reduces the amount of benefit to the community because it's restricting the use for sort of people in that situation. So if we could get more clarity around that, if this is deferred, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ibrahim.
Thank you, Chair. Just a recommendation to the applicant. I'm happy with the motion that's been moved now for deferral. Could we please ask them for recommendation if they can consider I know they've asked for a Class 2 change of use, but we are in great need of housing for big families, if that's something that they can consider as well and take into consideration, because this will be a potential house for a big family. Thank you.
I think that that's something that is up to the applicant. Obviously, we do try to encourage people to develop homes and develop larger homes, but that's purely a matter for the applicant and owner. But we could put it to them that that's a consideration that they might think about. Yeah. It's been moved and seconded. We defer this item. Those in favour? That's 9 for. Those against? And that's 2 against. So this item will be deferred, and hopefully we'll be able to gather as much information as possible and strongly invite the applicant to attend the next meeting. Thank you very much indeed. If we then move on to the next item, which is Land at Avon Lane for 23 dwellings. This is already an approved application, and what we're looking at today is reserved matters in association with that, which is appearance, landscaping, layout and scale. So if I can, in this case, ask Mr. Dickman to outline the application to us.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This application, as you can see, is for reserved matters. It relates to a site on the east side of Avon Lane at Moorside. Some members who've been on committee, either for a short or longer period of time, maybe recall this site. Most recently in 2019, where there was a similar application for reserved matters approval of 23 dwellings. So this particular proposal is for a variation to that scheme, and I'll explain as I go through the slides what the main aspects of that variation are. For those members who were here longer than that period of time, in 2017 the application was submitted in outline form for residential development on the site. That application was refused by Planning Committee and subsequently allowed at appeal. It was allowed at appeal with costs awarded against the council. So I just really want to make that point and to focus really on the issues that are part of this application. So matters such as the principle of development, the access point onto the site, details of the number of dwellings on the site. All these matters have previously been approved and are not open for consideration at this stage. So what we're dealing with, as you can see on the description, appearance, landscaping, layout and scale. So effectively it's the layout of the development, the type of properties, the design of the properties and their relationship with the neighbouring properties and the surrounding site. So this is the site, as I say, east side of Avon Lane, giving you just the red edge site and then showing it in the context of the surrounding development. This is the proposed layout, and as I say, it's very similar in a general arrangement to the previous reserve matters approval. So the road layout, where it comes into the site, where it manoeuvres round and heads in the southerly direction, that's very similar to the previous approval. Similarly, you can see there are some areas of open space on the site in the dark green at the entrance and then at the eastern boundary of the site. They again reflect the previous scheme. In terms of this layout, and I'll go through the details, the kind of dark coloured property at the top left-hand side is of different design to the remaining properties on the site. So the various other properties, 23, 16 3-beds and 7 4-bedroom properties on the site. Just give you some views from the road. So obviously it's not like this at the moment, but the site showing its original design from the Avon Lane, Avonside Close junction. And these are a couple of pictures of the relationship with neighbouring properties. So you've got Hill Road there, which is on the northern side of the site. The property at the front there fronts onto Avon Lane itself. These are the properties along the western boundary of the site on Avonside Close, and I'll come back to these a little bit later on. It's not entirely viewable on this, although you get some impression. There is obviously a change in levels. The land rises or drops away from the position of the photograph towards the houses. These are taken from 162 Avon Lane's garden. It's just showing again a view from a neighbouring property into the site, and I'll just explain a little bit more about that shortly. And as I say, the site doesn't look like that now because it's subsequently been fenced off. What this photograph does show you is the access position to the site. And as I say, that aspect of the development, that's already been approved. That's not for further consideration. There are also requirements associated with the outline approval for traffic calming measures on Avon Lane. Again, they are not for reconsideration at this stage. So again, back to the layout, and we'll work our way through the site. This is the property at the entrance to the site, and this has been designed differently to the others because of its configuration. So you can see it's a slightly different angle, different proximity to the site. And the reasoning for that is obviously to ensure no loss of privacy or overshadowing of the neighbouring properties at the back. And that's been done. If you look in the centre of the picture, the third one down gives you the rear elevation. As you can see, that apart from secondary windows and roof lights, there are no overlooking windows in that elevation of the site. The other change between the one that was previously approved, and it's not necessarily come about as a result of this plot, but as some of the other changes on the layout, we have recommended on this application we take away permitted development rights, which obviously, as you're aware, could allow, whilst the relationship with the neighbouring property is considered acceptable at the moment, some fairly substantial permitted development extensions could otherwise be developed on the site. So we're just ensuring that that satisfactory relationship remains. So as I say, that's the plot, just giving you a 3D visualisation of the property at the entrance to the site. As we move round, and I'll just go through these fairly quickly, I appreciate they'll be fairly small. These are the house types on the site, and as I say, they are very similar to the ones that have been previously approved, apart from there's been some variations in the layout within the sites. There's some reconfiguration of the properties, and in particular the properties facing Hill Lane, Hill Road, they've lost the detached garages that were originally proposed. Off-street parking still remains, 2 spaces minimum for each of those properties, but the garages have been removed. Again, just showing you visualisations of those properties. And again, this is at the, if you like, showing the bend as the site comes round. So on the right-hand side, that's heading back towards Avon Lane. And then to the properties I'm going to move on to on the left-hand side. So this is at this junction. So we're now going to move down to the bottom of this layout to these properties that are lined up in the blue. These are the house types themselves. The front elevation faces out towards the fields, the main fields to the east of the site. The rear elevation, which is the third one down, as you can see, that's the elevation that's facing 2-storey towards the existing properties on Avonside Close. These are the visualisation again, just from the street scene. And I've gone back to Avonside Close because this is one of the main changes in the scheme. As a result of the ongoing negotiations taking place with United Utilities in terms of the drainage of the site, again a matter dealt with at outline stage, there has been a proposal to, if you like, raise the levels of these properties relative to the approved scheme. That's a section showing you the approved property. So obviously the existing property, the shaded area on the right-hand side, and the approved property. The proposed property, as you can see, is elevated, and this is to ensure adequate drainage away from these buildings. Clearly, it also means that it's relative to the existing properties on Avonside Close. It is elevated by about 3 metres. The separation distance between the existing and proposed 27 metres, and that is important. That's well above the standard you would normally require. If these were built on a flat level, normally you'd be looking at around 21 metres. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier on, we're recommending that permitted development rights are taken away. So obviously, that's the relationship as it stands. That would be the relationship in the future, or if any of these residents wish to have extensions on their property, they'd have to come to the council for those to be determined separately, and obviously with them be able to make an assessment as to whether that made the situation worse. This again, is just it'd be quite small on the screen, but it's giving you that comparison between the two properties. And again, this landscaping as a final with new tree planting, some hedge planting. As I say, there are 2 areas of open space on the site as originally approved, and they'll be retained. So as you see in the report, the application is recommended for approval subject to the matters. Obviously in the outline, they'll still apply, so the applicant still needs to deal with those issues, the drainage and the access and traffic calming measures and so forth, and to the additional conditions that are in the report, including the condition of removing permitted development rights. On that basis, it is recommended, Chair, that the application be approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Dickman. Has anybody got any questions? Councillor Surgeon?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question I just would like to ask is, first of all, does that particular plot of land have any special designation? And secondly, on page 24 of our report, can you just clarify, it says here, it is recognised that future development under permitted development rights to these properties could lead to a loss of privacy or overshadowing of neighbouring properties in the future. Therefore, it's recommended that such rights are removed. Can you just clarify exactly what that means? Because I'm not sure I fully understand. Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor. So that's in relation to why we're taking permitted development rights away, is it?
Yes, on page 24, towards the bottom, the second to last paragraph.
Under normal circumstances, all residential properties are allowed certain extensions without needing to come to the council for planning permission. On a detached building, for example, they could build a 2-storey rear extension, which would obviously then bring the properties much closer to the neighbouring boundaries. They may turn out to be acceptable. They may be designed in such a way that it's not a problem. So that what we're making clear here is that we're not necessarily going to refuse all those applications. You can't have a moratorium that says you can't have extensions. But what it does, it gives back the council the control to be able to make a judgment. So if somebody on one of those properties wanted a conservatory, for example, it's likely to be approved because it's not going to cause any further overlooking. Obviously, if it came out 10 metres, it would be an issue, but as you saw from the section, the levels would probably prevent that in any case. So it's just to give an extra bit of control, which under the planning regulations, normally most houses don't have to come to the council. They can build various extensions. I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Has anybody else got any further questions? No? Sorry, Councillor Alan-Jani.
Thank you, Chair. It's just with regards to, on the consultation, it's a phrasing I haven't seen before from United Utilities. And you talked a little bit about the drainage and the conditions on the outline application. It says they object to the development until an acceptable drainage scheme has been agreed, rather than, it should be subject to the original conditions. And that struck me as a bit odd. And then as you went through the application, the levels of the properties are determined by a drainage scheme, or this is how it came across, are determined by a drainage scheme which hasn't been agreed. So if it kind of feels like we're agreeing to something that isn't set in terms of those levels, because that hasn't come through. Can you just talk me through why it's specifically an objection and how that would work in terms of doesn't seem to be settled yet? Thank you.
Okay, well, as I say, the drainage, the scheme for approval of the drainage is part of the outline approval. So that is dealt with by that purpose. So the two, as you'll be aware from previous applications, the two linked elements to this. So you've got the conditions on the outline, they all have to be complied with, and then you obviously have the reserved matters that itself will include some conditions. So you'll have two approvals. They've got to apply for all of them. My understanding is that the negotiations with United Utilities, although we've not had formal confirmation from UU that the detailed scheme has been approved, that they are nearing approval. And it's for that reason that the applicant has felt confident that the reserved matters can now come forward in this scheme. If this application is approved, then obviously they can conclude those. It's a bit of chicken and egg. They can conclude those discussions. If members decided, no, we're not happy with this, we want you to look at lowering the levels, of course that then has an impact on the discussions that they're holding separately. So it is whichever one comes first, but they've still got to comply with both those elements. My understanding is if this scheme is approved, then the drainage is there or thereabouts, to be approved, and then the applicant will have to come back to us for condition discharge on the outline approval to get that agreed as well. So the two things are running side by side, and one of them has to come before the other. They could get all the paperwork on the, I think it's section 114 agreement with UU on this, and then suddenly find they're going to have to go back and change it again. So what we're looking at is making sure the planning application is approved first, then they can finalise those details. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hussain.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, the bottom left-hand corner, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dwellings. My question is, where is because I also noticed on one of the photographs that they've all got garages. Where would be the access? Because the road actually ends after the 5 properties. I'm a bit confused with that. The bottom left-hand corner, there's 5 dwellings. How would they access the garages there? Is that a road or what?
You mean the ones in the bottom left-hand corner?
The bottom 5 properties on the left-hand side. The road ends. Yeah. So how do they access the garages?
If I go back through that.
Yes.
So what you can see there is if you like, those properties as they're facing east, so on the right-hand side. It's obviously an indicative, this. So in the background there is where the access road comes in. So beyond this row, if you can visualise it, and the house just beyond, the road then turns round and heads towards Avon Lane. So the traffic comes in, if you like, at the back of these, then comes from the kind of mid right-hand side, and then that's the access in. So it's a cul-de-sac, But this is how, and obviously these are the parking spaces at the front of the properties. So we're going to go back onto there. So effectively, the area coming down, I don't know, can you see my cursor? Yeah. So coming down there, that's the junction with Avon Lane at the top. They come down into the site, onto this point. This is where the adopted highway finishes, and effectively this becomes a private drive. So that's why it's in a kind of different coloration. And then you get access, obviously, to parking there. Each of these is a detached property, so obviously for bins and such like, they've got access through to the back of the site. So there's no access beyond there. That comes to a nursery site beyond that boundary. So it's a cul-de-sac, effectively. Does that answer your query? Thank you.
Councillor David.
Thanks, Chair. You might have covered it, so apologies if I missed it. The height of the properties are being raised. Is the reason for that because of flooding, so the bottom pit won't be accommodation, it'll just be to cover if it does flood? Is that the reason?
It's not so much about flooding as actually getting drainage to the properties because of the different levels on the site. So it's actually getting the services to the site itself, and that's why they've had to raise up the site levels. So it's not about flooding per se. It's about servicing the properties for the foul and surface water drainage.
So if I can come back on that then, so the bottom bit of it though won't be occupied, will it? It'll be like just brickwork with nothing under there, whatever the drainage is. Well, the height of the properties has been raised to allow the drainage situation to help with that. But the bit at the bottom where it's been raised, there'll be no living accommodation in there, will there?
No. As part of some of the discussions that we did have with the applicant, there was an idea of sticking, it's not habitable accommodation, but extra space in that lower level. And one of the concerns we had was, again, the relationship with Avonside Close. That, one, we've got a raised level, but also they're looking at a two-storey dwelling. They would have been looking at a three-storey dwelling on the site, and we considered that would be too intrusive as an increase. So no, this scheme doesn't include a lower level of accommodation. It's a two-storey dwelling, and then obviously the roof above that. And that's the same as the previous scheme. Well, in fact, I could go back to the... Oops. Just get that comparison there, so you can see. Oops, where have we gone? Sorry, technology. Right, so that's the approved property, and as you can see, it's effectively accommodation over 2 floors. So effectively, it's infilled underneath. It remains a 2-storey property, but obviously the ground floor level is now higher than the approved scheme.
Yeah, okay. And so the other thing was, just to be clear on the garages, are any of the properties having garages at all, or just certain ones are being removed?
It's the properties that had detached garages proposed with them that are being removed. These properties, the ones we're now looking at, obviously have got integral garages with them. Some of the properties on the entrance road as you came in, so the ones that back onto Hall Hill Road, they're the ones that had, some of those properties had detached garages in the back gardens. They've been removed. And in fact, there's some benefit in that, because for those properties on that side of the site, there'll be less development closer to their boundary. But as I said previously about the permitted development rights, what that means is that if one of those future residents wanted a garage, then they'd have to apply for planning permission for it, and that would allow us to make an assessment of whether that relationship was acceptable or not. But each of these properties has got at least 2 off-street parking spaces, and the ones at the bottom end with the integral garages have obviously got more than that. You know, the 2 outside spaces and the garage if they choose to use it.
Thanks.
Is there any more questions? If not, could I ask Mr. Cash to address the meeting? Mr. Cash, when you're ready.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to voice my concerns regarding this application. The application is defective in several ways. The report states that the development would have minimum effect on residential amenity. Yet the properties on the rear of Havenside Close will be significantly affected by overlooking and overshadowing due to the enormous difference in levels between the proposed houses and the rear of the existing properties. The site layout boasts minimum 22 metres spacing between existing properties and new build, yet the building on plot 2 is only 14 metres from 162 Avon Lane, and plot 1 is only 3.5 metres away from the boundary wall, which causes significant problems relating to privacy, and as the dormer bungalow is only 800 millimetres lower than a house, the effective shadowing in the existing rear guarding is to such an extent that the natural sunlight will be prevented for nearly 6 months of the year, whereas it receives sunlight all year round. At the moment, there are 7 properties that do not meet national described space standards regarding internal layout sizes, which are against government policy. The proposal is scale and development of 23 properties, and although the principle of traffic calming has been approved by the Planning Inspectorate, the final say, should it be approved, is with Highways Committee and is subject to a neighbourhood consultation. The planning officer included in the decision that the traffic calming should be completed prior to occupation of properties, so this application doesn't make sense, since the properties could be already built and the traffic calming refused. The construction operation for these dwellings is also a danger to road users, and therefore we request a further condition stating that no development in relation to this application can commence until traffic calming scheme has been implemented based on highway safety. We were unaware until this meeting tonight that the drainage system had not been approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cash. You've raised 1 or 2 issues there. I'd just like Mr. Dickman to address them.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I feel I have to sort of make a comment at this stage because unfortunately there were some comments made there by Mr. Cash that weren't actually correct, and I think it needs to be mind committee. The relationship between the property at 162 Avon Lane and the approved properties on site has already been approved. That part of this development has not changed. So whether members this evening feel that, well, that's not an acceptable relationship or not, there is an approval for that, and that is not, in that context, a justifiable means to refuse the application. I did explain in my presentation that permitted development rights are being removed. They weren't removed on the previous scheme. If the applicant was able to implement the previous scheme, it may well be they could build this property and the new residents could move in. All the issues in relation to the principle of the development have already been approved. That includes the access to the site and the traffic calming measures. And you had a suggestion that the traffic calming measures need to be put in place before any of the development takes place. The inspector granted approval subject to a condition which basically states that prior to first occupation of any dwelling, the access and traffic calming arrangements shall be implemented in full. That, as I say, is part of the outline approval. That is not open for consideration again at this stage. So we have no powers to change the timetable of that works. A separate process does need to take place for those traffic calming measures, and that will involve residents being given the opportunity to comment on that. It's separate to this particular application and the details that you can consider at this stage. And it's a little bit like, obviously, Councillor Alan Darney was making the point earlier on, because there's two elements to this, they're both reliant on one another. So even if this application's approved tonight, the applicant can't occupy any of the approved properties until that traffic calming's been through its separate process and it's all been approved. That remains the case. That can't be altered. There are no powers within the context of this application to alter that arrangement. So those issues, they're already there. There's a comment about the development not meeting national space standards as well, and this being almost a government protocol. As it's set out, if you have a local plan policy which defines that, which we don't have, we are, as members will know, we're working towards an updated local plan. The local plan that's adopted predates the national space standards, so it is not a definitive requirement of development, although you'll know from previous discussions, members have ensured that they do meet those standards. These properties meet those standards. They are relatively spacious, detached properties, and the standards within them are acceptable. They are similar to the type approved under the previous Reserved Matters application. So thank you for letting me come in on that, Chair, but I did feel it was necessary to make those points clear at this stage. Thank you.
Is there any further questions at this stage? That's to Mr. Cash. Okay. If not, could I ask Ms. Philcox to address the meeting on behalf of the, she's the agent for the developers.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm Ellie Philcox, the agent for the application. Thanks for the opportunity to speak at committees today to represent these Reserved Matters proposals on behalf of my client, Cube Homes. Cube Homes is the private sector arm of Great Places Housing Group, who are one of the leading developing housing associations in the North West. Cube was set up to develop high-quality homes for market sale and private rent, the profits of which are gifted back to Great Places Housing Group each year to fund the provision of more affordable homes and other services. Cube are experienced in delivering quality developments of the scale and nature proposed at Haven Lane. As set out very clearly by your officer, the principle of this development and the highways access has already been established in the granting of the outline consent, and it's not to be revisited as part of this application. However, I do note that there's been a couple of concerns raised, which hopefully I can provide a little bit of comfort on today. The first being the issue with regarding drainage. The amended Reserved Matters proposals are as a result of further discussions which have taken place with United Utilities. The discussions with United Utilities have been ongoing for a number of months in respect of the required condition and the outline consent. These discussions have been very positive, including a number of meetings on site, and we're close to agreeing the technical details of a drainage scheme. The second point is just regards to the highways works and the traffic calming scheme. Again, something which isn't a part of this application, but just to provide, I guess, a little bit of comfort, that is something that my client is looking to resolve as soon as practicable, following granting of a consent if granted. As I understand, that matter is kind of outside of the planning system, is under the Highways Act, but there is a requirement under that process for there to be consultation with residents, so that obviously will take place at the appropriate time. I hope that the committee is able to support your officer's recommendation, and I'm happy to answer any questions if that will be helpful. Thanks.
Has anybody got any questions at this stage? No? Okay. Could I ask Councillor Sharp to address the meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, everyone. I'm just here today to speak on behalf of the Haven Lane community. This is a planning application that's been going on for much longer than I've been the councillor for the ward. So it has been a real distress to the residents around here, and I do know that we're not here to discuss the actual application, but I do just want to raise objection to the way residents have been treated over the years. They do feel completely let down and pushed to one side. But in regards to the reserve matters, I understand that the highways issue is something that has previously been decided, but for me, I do find it bizarre that we can sit here today and talk about something that relies on an issue which hasn't been resolved yet. Not just one issue, but two, both drainage and the traffic consultation. How do we know that those two issues are going to be resolved? How do we know that the United Utilities issue will come up with a plan? How do we know that the traffic consultation will work in favour? I don't see the benefit of us sitting here and deciding something which could be altered completely in a month or two. At the moment, Haven Lane has 370 existing homes feeding into the lane, plus recent developments of 46 on Haven Lane South and...
Could I just stop you there? We are talking about reserve matters here. We aren't talking about a decision that the inspector made, not this council. This committee refused the application. It was subsequently overturned. Our decision was overturned at appeal, and the planning inspector came up with those decisions regarding traffic. And those are decisions that we cannot change or alter. So it would be possibly helpful if you actually concentrated on the application that's before us today, which is the reserve matter application.
Thank you. I was just moving on to the reserve matters, but I do understand the issue about the highways. I think Mr. Cash pointed out all of the issues that the residents have in regards to the layout of the plan, but I am glad to hear that the permitted developments have been removed, and it would be, I think, great for that. I think all residents are grateful that that has been removed, and yeah, that's everything for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? Councillor Dermot.
Yeah, there was a couple of things you raised. The traffic calming issue. Did you hear Mr. Dickman said that, I mean, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, he said that they were going to be in place before anybody could live in the properties. He'll correct me if I'm wrong on that one. So you mentioned that, so, you know, that one's covered. There was another one with drainage, and that's what this is about, partly the drainage. That's what part of this reserve matters is about, drainage. So that's going to be dealt with as well. So, I mean, do you understand that?
Yeah, thank you. I do understand. I was just raising my concerns, like many others, with the drainage and the other issue about the highways. I was just saying that I think making a decision without those two being completed is something that I didn't see the reason why.
You'll have to take that up with the planning inspector, I'm afraid. Is there any further questions? Okay. The matter's open for discussion. Councillor Alandani.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question about whether this is possible given what's been done before. There is still the drainage scheme to be agreed. is it reasonable to put a clause into the conditions for approval to say that kind of work on the buildings cannot start until, or is that already been covered? Or could we insert it here in terms of that time scale? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's part of the reserve matter, but I'll get it confirmed. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Well, I've got, as I say, this is a copy of the outline conditions that are in place. So, no above, this is the wording, as the inspectors worded it, no above ground works shall take place until a scheme for the design, construction and drainage of the estate road associated footways has been approved. There's also a condition prior to commencement of development, details of disposal of foul and surface water need to be approved. So all these things, those conditions are already worded, they're already in place. We have no powers, you know, whether we as officers agree with how the inspector put those terms in place. We have no powers to change that. So the timescales that are on each of those conditions about landscaping as well and the highway access, they're not within the remit of this application to change or control.
Councillor Gloucester.
Thank you, Chair. It's just about this permitted development situation. I know on some properties there's things like a covenant in place. Does this removal of permitted developments remain in place forever, or does it expire after 10 years or whatever? Because I know that previous developments, it's the developer's responsibility that will place a covenant on the properties, but once that developer either moves on, dies, goes out of business, whatever, there's nobody to enforce that. So I just don't really understand how the removal of permitted developments will be managed.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, obviously, covenant members will be aware of this because it's been discussed previously. Covenants, other private agreements, or controls over other legislation operate completely separately to the planning system. So, for instance, if we didn't have that permitted development removal condition on, but there was something in the covenant, in the deeds of each of these properties saying that they had to get the freeholder's approval, that would still be the case. The two things will run separately. In terms of the planning side of things, as I said, we're not intending to say to these residents, you can never have an extension to your property. What we're saying is that we want to see what that extension is because of what we see as the relationship with neighbouring properties, particularly because of levels across the site. The rights you would normally have as a householder, if this had been a completely flat site, we wouldn't have recommended taking those rights away. But we want to make sure that those relationships with the existing properties remain acceptable. And as I said earlier, you know, it may well be somebody comes in for a smallish single-storey extension on the back. It's probably likely to get permission. They come in for a two-storey extension on the back or a rear dormer or something of that nature. It may well be that that is refusable, so long as obviously the planning merits justify that decision. But that is completely separate to the deeds. So how that conditions controlled is through the council as local planning authority. Thank you, Chair.
I get that, but how long is it enforceable for? That's my question. How long does this last? Is it forever? Is it for 10 years?
It runs with the permission, so it will apply. So, for instance, I live on an estate that was built, 30 odd years ago, and permitted development rights have been removed, and I regularly see applications from my neighbours and so forth for extensions. So it still carries, in 30 years' time, it will still carry, you know, so that control is there and remains in place. Thank you.
Is there any further comments? Councillor Alandana.
So this is more, I'm almost talking or just wanting clarity, I hope for yourselves. In terms, if we approved this and there's this subject to the drainage scheme being agreed, now the height levels are going to be determined by that. But if we're approving it on the principle of the levels as described in this scheme. So if anything were to change, if the drainage scheme were to demand that there were a different height level, then that would mean that this was in effect not null and void, but it doesn't apply because that can't happen. So that I'd have to then be explored again. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, if planning permission is granted today, the developer can go back to United Utilities and say, right, this is our approval, can we finalise these agreements? If United Utilities suddenly go, oh no, it still needs to be raised by another 1-2 metres, then no, they wouldn't be able to implement this scheme. So yes, that will still remain the case, yes. Thank you.
And so for the purposes of the kind of concerns of the residents, to the power that we can, given the previous planning decision, if something unexpected were to happen, then they're not in for that unless it would require a separate planning decision.
Yes, if it was varied, you'd have to, if they decided to do something differently, they would actually have to reapply, as I understand it.
Yeah, the approved plans are for this particular scheme in this particular configuration. That includes the levels on the site as well. Thank you.
Okay, has anybody else got any contributions? If not, I will move approval with the appropriate conditions. And Councillor Hussain seconds it. All those in favour? I think that's 11. Those against? And 1 against. So that's approved. Thank you very much indeed. There's no further business this evening, so I'll close the meeting. And thanks very much for your patience and attendance.